For this week's history video, I'd like to talk about the beginning of the events that led to the Civil War. What we'll be doing over the next 2 or 3 weeks is talking about the various actions that backfired on the people that did them and led inexorably to the Civil War. It was a series of miscalculations by the North and the South and by most major politicians that led to the Civil War, and the first of these was the Compromise of 1850. Last video, we talked about how Polk doubled the size of the United States. James K. Polk, the 11th president, won the war with Mexico, bought the Oregon Territory from Britain, and expanded the United States all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. But then the question became, how would these states enter the Union? Would they enter them as slave states or as free states? And the South was very conscious, as always, of trying to keep the number of slave and free states basically equal. Well, in this case, they relented a little bit, and after 4 years of fighting, agreed on a compromise called the Compromise of 1850, brokered by Henry Clay, in which the senator from Kentucky, the Whig leader, in which California was admitted as a free state. Arizona and New Mexico were denied admission to the Union until later. They didn't really come in until the 20th century, and were organized as territories where they would decide themselves whether to be free or slave. Everybody knew they would be free because you couldn't really have slaves in the desert community like that. But what the South got in return for these concessions was a very strong Fugitive Slave Act, which made it a federal responsibility, not a state responsibility, a federal responsibility, to catch fugitive slaves who had run away from the South and were sheltering in the North. And it further made it a federal crime either to obstruct their arresting of a fugitive slave or to shelter a fugitive slave and not to turn him in. That was the first time that slavery really infected the North. Until then, the North's opposition to slavery had basically been a matter of principle, a matter of politics, not wanting to be dominated by the Southern plantation power. But now, the Fugitive Slave Act put slavery right squarely on the table of every Northern family, because in Boston, a few years after that, a slave tried to run away, and he showed up in Boston, and the feds closed in to arrest him, and there was a riot. The people of Boston went crazy defending the former slave from apprehension. And people were locked up for not turning in slaves. They were locked up for protecting slaves. And there was an increasing feeling in the North that the Fugitive Slave Act was making them complicit in the evil of slavery, which was really the first step down the road to civil war. Now, the 12th president after Polk was Zachary Taylor, who was the general in the Mexican War, who we talked about last week, who had conquered Buena Vista and the northern territory near the Texas border. He was very popular. He was elected president. He died after a year and a half. He was a slave owner from Louisiana, and everybody thought he'd be pro-slavery, but he wasn't. He was anti-slavery. And when he died, Millard Fillmore, the 13th president, took office, who was a Northerner, but was more pro-slavery. And Fillmore worked out with Henry Clay the passage of the Compromise of 1850. But things descended pretty quickly after that. And in the next video, we'll talk about how the Missouri Compromise that had preserved the peace, that North-South differentiation, was overridden by the doctrine of popular sovereignty. And then after that, we'll talk about Lincoln and his role and the abolitionist role, and how ultimately all of this led to a civil war that Lincoln had once, or Seward had once called, the irrepressible conflict. Thanks very much.